Welcome everyone to the virtual Marxist library. My name is Gene Rule, and I'm a member of the working group that puts these programs on. I handle the mailings and used to make the coffee, as I said, but not now. And I'll remind everyone that, but I do have my own coffee, so not to worry. And want to remind everybody that this meeting is being recorded, so bear that in mind if you bear that in mind. Let me just say a few words about the Institute here. The Institute for the Critical Study of Society was formed to further the goals of the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library of preserving our written heritage, as well as supporting emerging struggles for racial and gender equality and for socialism. The members of ICSS are active in different aspects of people's struggles in the Bay Area and globally. Some of us are affiliated with specific political parties and tendencies, others are not. We respect one another, but we do not necessarily agree on all issues. Accordingly, the opinions expressed in our lectures and workshops and publications are those of the authors only and do not represent a group consensus on the issues concerned. We are united, however, in our respect for the work of Karl Marx and our belief that his work will remain as important for the class struggles of the future as they have been for the past. As a group, we continue to draw inspiration from the work of Karl Marx, especially his 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Now, our topic for today is the origin and evolution of Varna-Caste systems and its articulation with class dynamics. Our speaker is Abhinav Sinha, and this topic may seem distant from our real struggles that's going on outside today, but I want to remind you that underlying the struggles we have in the streets today is our racialized caste system, which is one example of a much more widespread phenomenon. And the paradigmatic example of that is, of course, the Varna-Caste system in India. So by paying attention and understanding that system, perhaps we can understand our own better, and this will inform our struggles. And I want to turn it over to Raj, who's going to introduce our speaker and handle our program.
Thank you, Gene. Abhinav, it is my pleasure to introduce him. Has been an activist in the revolutionary movement in India since 1999. He's much younger than all of us, most of us here, not all of us. I know there are some people who are young here also, which I'm glad to see. He has organized on student front and youth front, as well as workers front. He writes the blog Polemique. He has written extensively on caste system. Ambedkar, who was an iconic Dalit leader of India in the middle of the 20th century. That was his period of action. Hindutva fascism, he has worked on, he has written on that. Marx's Capital, he has written on, and on labor relations in India, migration, and a variety of other issues. He's the author of the books Subversive Interventions and What is Fascism and How to Fight It. First volume of his third multi-volume book on Soviet socialist transition will soon be out. He's editor of a political newspaper of workers called Mazdoor Bigul, which means Workers' Bigul, translated into English. But it comes out in Hindi and several other languages, and it's distributed to workers in northern India, as far as I know. Maybe you will correct me. It goes beyond the north and west, northern and western India. He's also a member of the convening committee of the Revolutionary Workers' Party of India. So with that introduction, I'll ask Abhinav, please begin his presentation.
Thank you, Comrade Raj, for this introduction, and revolutionary greetings to all comrades who can hear me from India. Lal Salam, red salute. The topic which we are going to discuss today is a very vast topic, and it has been a matter of contention among Indian as well as foreign historians of India for past 6 or 7 decades. If we deduct the colonial historiography or the histories written by colonial administrators before political independence of India. But for past 6-7 decades, the question of origin and evolution of caste system has remained at the center of controversy among historians, especially historians of ancient India. So within 50-60 minutes, I would be only able to make some very preliminary observations that I have about the origin and evolution of caste system, which will, rather than satisfying most of the listeners, will kind of provoke them and incite them for further studies and further research into this specific phenomena that Indian subcontinent witnessed. Second thing, I would apologize beforehand due to this relief work for migrant workers. I didn't have much time to prepare for the presentation, but still I would try my best to make things clear as possible in these 50 minutes. So without any further ado, I will begin my presentation. The first point that I would like to make, that in order to understand what is caste or what is Varna-Caste system, I would hark back to Marx's directive that to be a radical means to go to the root of the things. Or as Lenin said in his famous lecture in the Sverdlov University called The State, that the best way to approach any subject matter is to approach it historically. So the best way to understand caste Varna system is to approach it historically. And when we approach it historically, the first most important question that faces us is how did it originate? How did Varna caste system originate? Only then we can answer the question, what is Varna and what is caste? I'm particularly referring to this problem because most of the sociological studies of Varna caste system in India tend to have a disregard for the history of Varna caste, and they kind of capture different snapshots of the contemporary situation with the special context of Varna caste system, but they don't approach it historically, and that is why their conclusions are very metaphysical. It's kind of four blinds trying to understand what an elephant is. So one grabs its legs and says that it's like a pillar. One grabs its tail and says it's like a rope. And that is the major problem with sociological studies. And this lacuna can only be corrected through by a historical approach. So how did Varna caste system originate? Now, I would only talk about the established opinion among the best of the materialist historians. I'm not only talking about Marxist historians, those historians who are not idealists, but follow a historical materialist method or materialist method in general. The general consensus is that we witnessed 2 waves of Aryan migrations between the third millennium, since the fourth and third millennium BC. The first wave of Aryan migration, and it is very important that these were not Aryan invasions as generally perceived. These were migrations which sometimes resulted in clashes, but sometimes they did not result in clashes, as far as the archaeological and literary evidence suggests. The first wave of Aryans was the wave, what has been called by D.D. Kosambi and Ram Sharan Sharma, all the best Marxist historians, as the wave of the pre-Vedic Aryans. And these were the Aryans which came before the Vedic Aryans. Vedic Aryans, the Aryans who created the Vedas, they arrived in India around 1900 BC. And these pre-Vedic Aryans came before them, I think around 800 years to 1000 years before the Vedic Aryans. And these were the Aryans who got settled in the northwestern part of Indian subcontinent, and they got assimilated with the aboriginal population which was living in the northwestern part of Indian subcontinent. And some of these were also the surviving elements of already declining Harappan civilization, the Indus Valley civilization. So these were the Aryans who got settled in the northwestern part of Indian subcontinent. They got assimilated with the aboriginal inhabitants of the region, which included the surviving elements of Indus Valley civilization. Then came the second wave of Aryan migration, which was the wave of Vedic Aryans. It started somewhere around 1900 BC, 1800 BC. And these Aryans, they referred to the already settled Aryans which were assimilated into the original population. They referred to them as Asuras or Dasyus in the beginning. And the early portions of Rig Veda, the earliest Veda, it talks about how it gives you some references which illustrate how these Vedic Aryans in a long drawn process defeated the pre-Vedic Aryans. And before this defeat, the pre-Vedic Aryans, who were called Asura or Dasyu, literally translated into English as demons or bandits. Asura is demon, Dasyu is bandit. But before they were defeated, the modern meanings of these terms, Asura and Dasyu, had not evolved. They were not bandits or demons. In fact, one of the major gods of Vedic Aryans, Indra, because Vedic Aryans had two kinds of gods. One were the this-worldly deities or gods, or others were otherworldly gods and deities. Indra was this worldly god, and for all the this worldly gods, the term Asura has been used. Asura means demons, which was the word used to characterize the pre-Vedic Aryans. So once the pre-Vedic Aryans were defeated, these words changed their meanings. Asura became demon, Dasyu became bandit, and one of the major defeated pre-Vedic Aryan tribe was called Sudra. And that is why the defeated pre-Vedic Aryans were termed in general as Shudra, because one of the major big tribe was called Sudra. So once they were defeated, the pre-Vedic Aryans, they were called Shudra. And this is how the four-fold Varna system came into existence. The first reference to four-fold Varna system, the four-fold Varna system was constituted by Brahmins at the top, Kshatriyas, and then Vaishyas, and then Shudras. But originally, when the Vedic Aryans came to northwestern frontier of Indian subcontinent, they were divided into three, not classes, because classes were still not there, but three you can call social stratifications based on primordial labor division, of which a primordial labor division which is there in almost all nomadic pastoral tribes. In fact, there is a very good work on social stratification within the pastoral nomads done by this historian called Bruce Lincoln. He studies various pastoral nomadic civilizations and says that one thing common that we find in all these pastoral nomadic civilizations is that they have threefold division. One is the social stratum of priests, the other is the social stratum of warriors, and the third is the social stratum of all the plebeian masses. within these pastoral nomadic tribes. But these cannot be termed class in the classical Marxist terms because there was still no surplus production. There was still no systematic and regular surplus production. So we cannot talk about classes as yet, but there is kind of a social stratification based on some kind of a pre-class tribal labor division, which existed in these tribes, as Marx also talks about and Engels has talked about. In all these pre-class tribal societies, we find sexual division of labor and different kinds of natural divisions of labor. And he also talked about the period of magical worldview when there was a functional value of all these rituals of hunting and gathering, because they used to believe that if certain rituals are done in a proper way, they will be successful in their game, or they will be successful in their gathering enterprises, etc. So this was this period, pre-class period of pre-Vedic Aryans, which we know from historical evidence now that these pastoral nomadic civilizations were divided into three social strata. One is of warrior, the other is of priests, and then the plebeian masses. So the Vedic Aryans also were no exception, and they were also divided into these three social strata. Once they defeated the Shudras, and this was it is very important to note that this was also the period of transition of the Vedic Aryans from the stage of pastoral nomadism to agriculture. It is also the period of discovery of iron in the Indian subcontinent. And with the beginning of the Iron Age in the 7th century BC, they started to clear up as the Vedic civilization moved eastwards in the plains of Ganga, mid-Gangetic plains. They were able to clear jungles. They were able to attain more and more fertile lands because of discovery of iron. And with this, settled agriculture began. With settled agriculture and iron plowshare agriculture, regular and systematic surplus production started. And with the beginning of regular and systematic surplus production, the class divisions within the Vedic society got consolidated. And this was precisely the period when the pre-Vedic Aryans were defeated. And the defeated pre-Vedic Aryan tribes were assimilated into the Vedic society as the fourth Varna, the Shudra Varna, the lowest of the four Varnas. And these Varnas, in the beginning, if you look at the first reference of Varna system, it comes from the latter part of the early Vedic period, from the Purush Sukt. It's a text which is part of Rig Veda. It is from the 10th mandala, 10th part of the Purush Sukt of the Rig Veda, which belongs to the latter part of the early Vedic period. It talks about, this is the first literary evidence of which talks about the fourfold Varna division, fourfold Varna-Caste division. And in this division, you don't find the three characteristic features of caste Varna system as we know it today. Namely, the hereditary labor division, second, the caste endogamy, and third is untouchability. When we are talking about this first reference of Varna system from the latter part of the early Vedic period, we don't find these characteristics in the Varna system. And that is why one of the best Marxist historians of ancient India and the most you can say efficient historians of ancient India, D.D. Kosambi, he says that Varna at the point of its origin was class. So Varna division in the latter part of the early Vedic period, as described in the 10th mandala of Purush Sukt of Rig Veda, is basically, it signifies the embryonic class division and embryonic social division of labor in the late early Vedic society. Because the early Vedic society, early Vedic period has been divided into two parts. It starts from the 17th century BC up till 1000 BC approximately, roughly. And from 1000 BC to 5th century BC is the latter Vedic period. But the early Vedic period itself has been divided into two parts. The first part of the early Vedic period and the latter part of the early Vedic period. So the latter part of the early Vedic period, this Purush Suk, this first reference of fourfold Varna division, comes from around, it's an approximation because we don't have enough evidence for that, but we have sufficient evidence to conclude that it is somewhere around 1100 BC, 1000 BC that this Purush Sukt was created, because these were texts which were oral traditions. These were redacted only around 2nd century AD, 1st century AD, 3rd century AD. So Rig Ved and all the other Vedas were basically oral traditions which were redacted a lot later. I mean, in the Christian era itself. So we can only have some good scientific simulations and guesses about what actually happened. But the general consensus among Marxist historians that this first reference of Varna division comes from around first millennium BC, 1000 BC. But at this point of time, we don't have the basic characteristic, the three pillars of caste system as we know it. That is Varna, the caste endogamy, hereditary division of labor, and untouchability. These develop later, and that is why D.D. Kosambi and Ram Sharan Sharma and Suvira Jaiswal, they are correct in concluding that at the point of its origin, Varna was nothing but it represented the embryonic class division of the latter part of early Vedic period. So first is this point, the first point that I want to make, which is important for the purpose of this presentation, is that Varna at its point of origin represented the embryonic class division and labor division which came into existence in the latter part of the early Vedic period due to this transition from pastoral nomadic ecology of pastoral nomadism to production relations of an agrarian economy. And I call ecology of pastoral nomadism because production relations of pastoral nomadism would be an oxymoron, misnomer, because there was no production as yet. And that is why V. Gordon Childe talks about the ecology of pastoral nomadism. He's quite right about it. So the first point is that Varna at its point of origin was nothing but it represented the embryonic class division of the latter part of the early Vedic period. Now, the second point that I want to make is that as the agricultural economy developed in the Gangetic plains between, you can say, first millennium BC up till 5th century BC, led to consolidation of class divisions in the Vedic society and the formation of state. The process of formation of state started by 7th century BC, 6th century BC, as these tribal chieftains and the system or a structure of tribal chieftains emerged as a state. And this process culminated in the rise of 16 tribal kingdoms in the 6th century BC, 5th century BC. This is the period when we witness for the first time in Indian history state formation in its full, in its complete sense, because before that we have class division, but state formation was still going on. Those who are interested in the formation of state in the Vedic period can refer to R.S. Sharma's small book. It's called Varna and State Formation in the Mid-Gangetic Plains, as far as I can remember. And they can also see his book, Looking for the Aryans. These are very good works which explain how state and Varna divisions emerged in the Vedic society and how in the beginning, at the point of origin, Varna divisions represented embryonic class divisions of the Vedic society. This process culminated in the consolidation of class divisions in the Vedic society and emergence of first states, tribal republic states in the Gangetic plains. There were 16 major tribal republics which emerged in the 6th century BC, 5th century BC, and this was also the period of Buddha and Mahavir Jain, which led to the establishment of two new religions, Buddhism and Jainism. But as these tribal republics emerged, what we witnessed is that the class division, as represented by Varna, they were ossified into religious codes. And this is something which differentiates Indian social formation, ancient Indian social formation, from other ancient social formations, the Greco-Roman antiquity, in one specific sense. Everywhere when class divisions come into existence, ruling classes devise and construct ideologies for legitimation of their rule and legitimation of the class domination that they enjoy. In India also, the Brahmins, which were the ideologues of the ruling class of India, which was represented by the combine of Brahmins and Kshatriyas in the latter Vedic period, in the period of these 16 ancient states of India, the Brahmins constructed an ideological device or legitimation for the class division of Vedic society, which was different from the ideological legitimations that we witness in other civilizations. In one particular sense, that these class divisions were codified into religious codes. In other civilizations, we witness that there are ideological legitimation of slavery. For example, in Roman civilization, we come across the term instrumentum vocale, which was devised to give a structural form to the subordination of slaves in the Roman civilization, which literally meant speaking instrument, instrumentum vocale. So the slaves were not even regarded as humans, but these ideological machinations were not codified or ossified into religious and ritualistic codes. What happened different from all these other civilizations was that the class division of a particular period was ossified ritualistically and religiously into codes. And that is why this complete overlap of Varna and class that we witnessed in the latter part of the early Vedic period, this complete overlapping came to an end, and Varna divisions became relatively autonomous from class divisions because they were ritualistically and religiously ossified, and you cannot create new Bible or new Avesta Zend or new Vedas or new Puranas or new Upanishads every day. Once you ossify or fossilize, as it were, the class divisions of a particular period into religious codes, then these ritualistic and religious divisions, they attain a relative autonomy from the class division and the production relations of that period. But this is not complete freedom or complete independence from class division. So what I call this new relation is the relation of correspondence. So instead of a relation of overlapping between the Varna and class, by the period of the emergence of 16 ancient tribal republics of India, we see that this total overlapping of Varna and class is disturbed. It comes to an end, and in place of this complete overlapping, what we witness is the development of a relation of correspondence. Now, this relation of correspondence, what does that mean? It means that the Varna division doesn't become totally autonomous or totally independent of class divisions, but it becomes relatively autonomous of class divisions. Once the class divisions undergo a radical change, then the Varna ideology and Varna hierarchy also has to undergo certain change. Before that, the class changes in the class dynamics of society, it kinds of moves within the old ritualistic hierarchy of Varna division. But once it becomes, this contradiction becomes, reaches a point of impossibility, we can feel some kind of tremors or some kind of disturbances in the old structural Varna hierarchy. And I would exemplify.
Can I interrupt you for 1 minute just for clarification?
Yes, sure.
Because people here are familiar with the word caste, and many of them may not be familiar, some are. with the
Yeah.
word Varna. So can you explain
Yeah.
that and then proceed? Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah, thank you, Comrade Raj. In fact, I missed this point. There is a difference between Varna and caste. For caste in Sanskrit and Hindi, we have the word jati. And for Varna, Varna is more like uh, the all historical comparisons and allegories are always incomplete. But the best parallel in the Western civilization is some kind of estate. Estate. So estate kind of thing. But Varna, we don't find the reference of the word mention of caste in ancient Indian literature till 2nd century BC. The first ancient Indian text which talks about caste is Ashtadhyayi of Pardini, which comes from 2nd century BC. Another text is Brihat Samhita of Varah Mihir. But here we have to keep in mind that in these two texts, the words caste and varna have been used interchangeably. They don't make a distinction between caste and varna. So we are pretty much sure that till 2nd century BC, the words varna and caste were same, jati and varna were same. But then we come across Yajnavalkya Smriti, another text from approximately the same period, which talks about varna and caste in two different senses in one instance. In rest of the instance in Yajnavalkya Smriti, the Yajnavalk has used varna and caste interchangeably, but at one place he has used it to mean two different things. So caste, what are castes and how varna caste system, as I mentioned, it emerged. What happened as the Vedic civilization expanded eastwards, various aboriginal tribes, they were defeated by the Vedic Aryans and they were assimilated into the Vedic civilization. We have also evidence of uh, tribes which were assimilated into the Vedic civilization in a peaceful process. Like Vedic civilization was expanding eastwards, they came across various non-Vedic tribes and they assimilated those tribes into the fold of the Vedic society, sometimes through violence, sometimes peacefully. But these new tribes, which were getting assimilated into the Vedic society, they created new castes in the Vedic society. So Varna is a broad division, and then you have caste, different caste within each Varna. So the priest class of the defeated tribes, they were assimilated into the Vedic society as new castes of Brahmin Varna. And the warrior class of the defeated or assimilated tribes, non-Vedic tribes, they were assimilated into the Vedic society as Kshatriya Varna, the new castes inside the Kshatriya Varna. And the plebeian masses of the non-Vedic tribes, which were assimilated or defeated by the Vedic Aryans, they were assimilated into the Vedic civilization as new castes within either Vaishyas. Vaishyas were the main agrarian Varna originally, or the Shudras, who originally supplied servile labor to the Vedic in the Vedic civilization. So castes are, you can say, sub parts of Varna. There are 4 Varnas, and then there are castes within each Varna. These castes were created through a long process of assimilation of non-Vedic Aryan tribes inhabiting the Gangetic plains. Uh, and as the Vedic civilization moved eastwards, these tribes were assimilated peacefully or violently into the Vedic society as new castes within different Varnas. So there is a difference between Varna and caste originally, and that is why Suvira Jaiswal is totally accurate when she says that when we talk about Varna system, we should use the term Varna caste system, as these new castes were assimilated into the Vedic civilization between 7th century BC and first millennium of the Christian era. So there is a difference between these two terms, and there is a history involved there. So yes, so what happened in India, which was different from the ideological legitimation of class divisions in all other societies.
Can I ask a question, Abhinav?
Sure, Comrade Dilip.
Yeah. So while we're on the subject over here of the division that you're talking about at the caste system, at what point did the untouchability aspect come into play? Because as you're explaining it, as I understand it, Shudras were the menial labor, the lower workers type. There was, and even today, to this day in India, there is really no untouchability as I know it. These are workers who work among you all day in and day out. So where is the untouchability, other than the fact that the Brits put a label on it to call it untouchable? Other than that, where is the untouchability factor? When did that come into play?
I will come to that in a little while.
Question. Let me clarify that we will wait till his presentation finished, but thank you, Dilip. That was a very relevant thing. But generally, please hold your questions until the end. But thank you, Dilip. That was very relevant for ongoing process here.
Thank you, Comrade. And I was going to come to the origin of untouchability in a little while. So first, the second point, the point that I want to make is that as the Vedic civilization developed and new tribes were assimilated into it as new castes within the four Varnas, and also some tribes were totally defeated and they were integrated into the Vedic society as the Pancham Varna. And this points to brings me to the question that Comrade Dilip asked: what is the origins of untouchability in this? As these new castes were being assimilated into the Vedic society, there were some tribes which were not agrarian. And Suviraj Jaiswal says those tribes which were still in the stage of pastoral nomadism, when those tribes were defeated, most of these pastoral nomadic tribes which were defeated were assimilated in not in the fourfold Varna structure, but they were assimilated into the Vedic society as Pancham Varna, another word that has been used for these tribes which were assimilated into the Pancham Varna, the fifth Varna. Pancham Varna literally means the fifth Varna, which were not classically there in the Vedic text, but as the Vedic civilization expanded eastwards, moved eastwards, certain tribes which were still practicing pastoral nomadism, when they were defeated, they were assimilated into the Vedic society as Pancham Varna. Another word that has been used for them is Antyaj people, Antyaj caste or Antyaj people. So Antyaj or Pancham Varna, these were the people who later became untouchable. Now, how did untouchability came into existence? This also is a big issue of controversy, but the broad consensus among Marxist historians is that the origins of untouchability can be found in two sources. One is the distinction made by Brahmins in the later Vedic text itself. Within the Shudras, they talk about Hina Shudra, which literally means low Shudra, and Ahina Shudra, non-low Shudra. So certain Shudra castes were characterized as doing lowly occupation. And it was not that these occupations were low or these occupations were, kind of polluting or low. The reason was that the exploitation of oppression of certain castes became so barbaric and naked that the Brahmins, in order to make their subordination structural, created a sense of repulsion towards them. So one Shudra caste about which the Brahminical texts say that they are heen Shudras or polluted Shudras or low Shudra is Chandalas. This is one caste which emerged later as one of the major untouchable castes. But certain castes which became untouchable later in the Vedic period and the latter Vedic period, they were not considered as low castes. For example, Chamars. For Chamars, we find the word Charmakara in the Vedic text. And they were not at all low caste or low Varna, because from going by the text of the Vedas, all the Vedic rituals, the material rules used in the Vedic ritual, it was to be carried into the leather bags. And these leather bags were made by these leather workers, the chamars, the charmkaras. So originally, the charmkaras were not considered as a low or polluted caste or antyaj or pancham varna. But later in the feudal period, this caste was uh, made into an untouchable caste, because the bulk of chamars, they supplied servile labor, agrarian labor as well as non-agrarian labor. And in order to make the oppression and exploitation of certain castes, the Brahminical texts, they created this notion of untouchability. The origin of untouchability, one source is this distinction in the latter Vedic text itself, which makes a distinction between Heen Shudra, low Shudras, and non-low Shudras, Aheen Shudra. So this distinction is one source. The other distinct source of untouchability is the conquest of non-Vedic tribes, which were in principle not agrarian but pastoral nomads. So various pastoral nomadic tribes which were conquered during the eastward expansion of the Vedic civilization in the period before the emergence of 16 tribal states, and even during the period of 16 tribal states. These tribes, which were pastoral nomads and conquered by the Vedic civilization, they were assimilated into the Vedic civilization as Pancham Varna, and untouchability still was not strictly imposed upon them. The best work on untouchability is written by Vivekanand Jha. He's considered the best historian of the origin of untouchability. In fact, he has come up with a new book called Chandalas. It's an excellent book. It's available to buy online, and I strongly recommend that book, Chandalas. And he talks about the origins of untouchability in that book. So he talks about two sources. One is the distinction between Heen and Aheen Shudra, and second is the conquest of pastoral nomadic non-Vedic tribes in the process of expansion of Vedic civilization before the emergence of 16 ancient tribal republics, and after the emergence of 16 ancient tribal states. So, yeah, so these tribes were later made into untouchable castes, especially from the first century AD, when we have the first evidence of emergence of feudal land relations. Because if we talk about the period of 16 ancient, how much time do I have, Comrade Raj?
You have at least 20 minutes. If you want more, I can give you more.
Great. No, I can wrap up in 20 minutes. So from the period from the 16 tribal republics till the Mauryan period is called the second urban revolution of Indian subcontinent. This was the period which has been called by R.S. Sharma as Shudra Vaishya mode of production, a mode of production in which the Brahmins and Kshatriyas constituted the ruling class, and they exploited the labor of the main peasant Varna, which was Vaishyas originally, and the Varna which supplied servile labor in the productive activity as well as non-productive activity. Because in India, we didn't have chattel slavery. And in India, the slavery that we had in Indian history was considerably different from the Greco-Roman slavery, slave mode of production, because the bulk of slave labor was not used in agriculture, in productive activities. The bulk of slave labor was still used as domestic slaves, mainly. But in Mauryan period, a lot of slave labor was used in farming also, because there was land which belonged to state during the Maurya period, and it is called Sita land. Maurya Empire was an empire which emerged after the decline of 16 ancient tribal republics. It was the first kingdom in true sense, first empire in true sense in the history of Indian subcontinent. So during the Mauryan period, we have the height of use of slave labor in productive activities. So in the state lands, the agriculture was done by slave labor. So this was the period in which commerce thrived, in which trade thrived, and in which urbanization thrived. So it is the period which has been termed as the second urban revolution of Indian subcontinent. The first urban revolution belonged to the Harappan civilization. So the second urban revolution, this was the period which preceded feudal mode of production in India. Feudal mode of production in India started after the collapse of Mauryan Empire and Indo-Greek principalities. After that, we see the first sprouting or first embryonic signs of emergence of feudal mode of production when the convention of giving land grants to Brahmins started. Now you see, when the production mode of production changes, the Varna hierarchy also changes. During the second urban revolution, when trade and commerce thrived, the Vaishyas, which were originally the peasant Varna, they were converted into trading Varna, and the Shudras, which supplied servile, slave, and subordinate labor, they became the class of dependent peasantry. It happened in the Mauryan period itself. So we see that the classical function, as determined by the oldest Vedic texts, Vaishyas were supposed to do agriculture, but they started to venture into trade and commerce. And the Shudras, which classically supplied the slave, subordinate, and servile labor, they were converted into the class of dependent peasantry. This happens in the Mauryan period itself. And again, for Brahmins, when feudal mode of production emerges in the 1st century BC, and it reaches its apogee in the Gupta period, Gupta Empire period, which starts from the 3rd century AD. By the 3rd century AD, the feudal mode of production is consolidated in the Indian subcontinent. And by that time, Brahmins, sorry, can you hear? Can all comrades hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So as the feudal mode of production emerges, Brahmins also received land grants, because when the trade and commerce collapsed and localization of economy happened in Indian subcontinent, the revenue of the state, the Mauryan state was a very cumbersome, huge, centralized state. The revenues of the state collapsed as the trade and commerce and urbanization collapsed. I cannot go into the detail why that happened. You can refer to History of Early Medieval India of R.S. Sharma to understand a decline of urban centers and decline of trade and commerce after the collapse of Mauryan Empire due to the restraint of time. But as the trade and commerce and urban centers declined after the collapse of Mauryan Empire, during the collapse of the Mauryan Empire, the state was faced with the problem of paying the priestly class, the Brahmin class, for its services. Now, the priestly class was rendering a variety of services by this time. During the Mauryan period, they were also emerged as dharmacharyas, those who were guardians of Varna hierarchy, and also emerged as the managers of agraharas. Agraharas were the new agricultural settlements. So Brahmins were appointed the managers and administrators of these new agricultural settlements in the Mauryan period itself. So Brahmins, who were, according to the Vedic and Upanishadic sources, any other function other than priestly functions was considered lowly for Brahmins. They were not even considered to be the head of a state, because that was a function reserved for Kshatriyas. For Brahmins, it was lowly and demeaning to be a king. But Brahmins also emerged as kings. During the Gupta period, they emerged as feudal landowning class also. When the states started giving remuneration for the services of the Brahmin Varna, not in cash, because trade and commerce collapsed, there was a demonetization, localization of economy, ruralization of economy, and due to that, the cash revenue, cash-based economy, it collapsed. And due to that, the state started paying in land grants So the king started giving land grants. The first evidence of land grants comes from the 1st century AD, and it reaches its height by the Gupta period, which was 3rd century AD, and it survived till 6th century AD, the Gupta Empire. And during that period, the feudal mode of production developed in India, and the convention of giving land grants to Brahmins developed. Now the Brahmins, the Vedic texts categorically mention that the Brahmins can take alms only in things, not in land or cash. But the Brahmins started taking land grants, and now there were new texts created by Brahmins to legitimate and justify this new practice, because there was a change in the nature of Brahmin Varna. Brahmin Varna was originally reserved only for priestly functions, but now it emerged as landlord class also, which was considered demeaning and lowly for Brahmins. But as the mode of production changed, there were changes in the Varna system. Vaishyas were converted from an agrarian Varna caste into a trading caste, and those Vaishyas who could not transform themselves into traders and mercantilists, they were converted into Shudras. If you anybody has interest in how a bulk of Vaishyas were converted into Shudras, they can read Suvira Jaiswal's book Caste, Origin, Function and Dimension, and there is another book by Suvira Jaiswal called The Making of Brahminical Hegemony. It has published a couple of years back. It's the cutting edge research in the emergence of caste system as far as I can see. So those Vaishyas who could not shift to trade and commerce, they were converted into Shudras. And Shudras, who were principally a kind of servile labor providers of latter part of the Vedic society, they were converted into the class of dependent peasantry. So why these changes are happening, and what I want to illustrate from these changes, that the Varna now did not overlap with class. There was a relation of correspondence, and as there were radical changes in the class relations, and as there were radical changes in the production relations, we witnessed certain shifts in the Varna hierarchy, in the ritualistic hierarchy of the Varna system. So it is not that Manu Smriti created Varna system, it was Varna, the class divisions in society and the dynamics of production relations, which ultimately led to shifts in Varna system. Otherwise, we won't be able to explain these changes in the Varna system. Even ritualistically and religiously, there were changes in the Varna system. If you look at the Atriya Brahman, or one of the earliest Upanishads, or the Vishnu Puran, you see a different Varna system if you compare it with the Vedic sources. For example, Rig Vedic sources, or the other latter Vedic sources, the hymns of Athar Ved, Sam Ved, Yajur Ved. And if you compare it with the Puranic sources, you see a difference. Brahmins earlier were not supposed to take land grants because it was lowly and demeaning for them. Now they were very happy to take land grants, and there was new justification and legitimation created in the Brahminical text itself. So it was the material conditions that were determining the ideological constructions, not the ideological constructions which were determining the material conditions of Varna system and class dynamics of Indian society. The second thing which illustrates this point is the spatial variation. Till now we have talked about the temporal variation as Varna system changed over time, but we can also see changes in the Varna system across regions. For example, in southern India, the two intermediate Varnas are not found, Kshatriyas and Vaishyas, because when the Vedic civilization reached southern part of Indian subcontinent, the peninsular part of Indian subcontinent, by that time, the peasant kingdoms of southern India had already emerged. So when the southern peasant kingdoms sought to legitimate their rule, they kind of imported Brahmins from northern India, who then created ideological justification for their rule. So in southern India, you see Brahminical texts which make distinction between Sat Shudra and Asat Shudra. Sat Shudra is the pure Shudra who belongs to the king class or the aristocratic class, and you have Asat Shudras who are nearer to the untouchables or the impure, untouchable Antyaj Pancham Varna population. So one of the major dominant castes of southern India is Vellal. So Vellal has been described by the Brahminical texts as the protector of Brahmins. This is precisely the characterization used for Kshatriyas in northern India, Gangetic plains. Why this happened? That these peasant kings were assimilated into the Varna hierarchy, not as Kshatriyas, but as Shudras. It was due to the fact that by the time Vedic civilization reached southern India, there were already peasant kingdoms emerged, and by that time, the peasants in northern India belonged to the Shudra Varna. And that is why Shudra status was given to these peasant kings. But then the Brahmins made a distinction between Sat Shudra and Asat Shudra in order to differentiate between the Shudras, Sat Shudras, which were considered equivalent to the warrior Varna or the ruling caste of northern India. So in eastern India also, if you go in Bengal, you don't find classically, originally, there were no intermediate Varnas, two intermediate Varnas in Bengal. There were only Brahmins and Shudras. In southern India also, only Brahmins and Shudras. But the Brahminical texts were created to justify this kind of class hierarchy. So new Brahminical texts were created, new ritualistic texts were created, new justification for this different kind of class structure was created. So what we see is that caste system, Varna caste system, it maintained a relationship of correspondence with the class relations of Indian society, which developed temporally as well as spatially also. They were different. So in across ages, we find different kind of Varna system, different kind of ritualistic hierarchy, different kind of religious status in the ladder of Varna system. And we also find different kind of Varna hierarchy spatially from northern India to southern India, for example. So what Varna system or Brahminical ideology is doing here, it is providing a very effective instrument to the ruling class of all kinds, from the peasant kings to the Kshatriya kings of northern India. And then again, even during the Islamic period, if you read the work of Irfan Habib, who has written extensively about the medieval Indian history, he says that the Islamic period didn't make any fundamental change to the Varna caste system, because in fact, they expressed a kind of a jealousy towards the Hindu civilization. In fact, one of the Turkish commanders who conquered the northwestern part of Indian subcontinent in the 11th century is found saying that these Indians have a very efficient system of controlling their subordinate population, and we wish that we could have this kind of system. But the Islamic kingdom did not adopt the Varna caste system officially, but it did not also destroy it or brought it to an end. It let it be. It let the Varna system be as it is. It did not tamper with the Varna system a lot. The only one Islamic observer who talks against Varna system is Al-Biruni. Except Al-Biruni, who was a scientist and logician, except Al-Biruni, you don't find a single Islamic reference which criticizes Varna caste system. The only reference which you find is from a Turkish commander from the 11th century who is quite impressed with the strategies of domination, exploitation employed by the Varna caste system. So during the Islamic period, feudal mode of production developed in a specific form, which you can call absolutist system. An absolutist kind of feudal system developed during the entire Delhi Sultanate period and the Mughal period, the total so-called Islamic period of Indian history. The Varna system did not witness any major change. New castes proliferated within the Varna system. New castes came into existence. Certain castes became dominant, which were not dominant before. Certain castes lost their hegemony, which used to be hegemonic. For example, those Brahmins who still lived on alms. Alms is like bhiksha, the things which people gave to Brahmins as remuneration for their services. The Brahmins who were not landowning class, they were denigrated to a level of untouchables, kind of untouchables. The word used for these Brahmins in certain areas of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar is Mangan Brahmin. Mangan Brahmin is those who live on alms and, they were kind of beggars, begging Brahmins. So, and these in certain villages, they were considered as untouchables. Those who are interested in looking at the case of untouchable Brahmins can read a book called Interpretation of Caste by Declan Quigley. It's an excellent book which talks about the case of untouchable Brahmins in northern India. So those Brahmins who were unable to transform themselves into landowning feudal class, they were denigrated and demeaned to the status of begging Brahmins, Mangan Brahmins, those who lived on alms. So traditionally, those Brahmins who lived only on alms, according to the Vedic text, they were the most superior, they were the highest, purest. And those Brahmins who accepted land grants, they were impure, because they were doing something which was uncharacteristic of Brahmins as far as the Vedic texts are concerned. So
sorry to interrupt. Can you wrap it up in about 5 minutes?
Yeah. So the point that I'm trying to make is this: the changes in the mode of production, the changes in the production relation, led to the changes in Varna-Caste system. The Varna-Caste system has a relationship of correspondence with class system. So how class and caste Varna are articulated, it can be explained by the relation of correspondence characterized by the relative autonomy of Varna caste from class, number one. The changes which happened during the British period, I would finish on that. Because certain anti-caste reformers and thinkers have said that Britishers were kind of saviors of Dalits and saviors of Shudra. Nothing can be further from truth. If we talk about the impact of British rule on caste system, we can talk about four impacts of, broadly three impacts of British rule on caste system. First was the land settlements. Land settlements, there were three kinds of land settlements introduced by the Britishers. First was the permanent land settlements, which fixed the land revenue for 30 years. But the most importantly, it started private property in land. For the first time, juridical legal private property in land in Indian history was started by the Britishers. And who were made the landowners? These were the Kshatriya landlords and the Brahmin landlords. Before that, there was no juridical legal private property in land, and therefore the private ownership of land by Kshatriyas and Brahmins still did not have any juridical legal backing as such by a modern state in the contemporary sense. But Britishers introduced private property in land, made Brahmins and Kshatriyas under permanent land settlement introduced by Lord Cornwallis in 1793. And this kind of consolidated the position of higher two Varnas at the landowning caste. The first thing. Second, two other land settlements were there. One was called made middle castes, certain middle castes, the owner of land, like certain Shudra castes, like Jats and Gujars and Yadavs. Certain middle castes, certain Shudra castes were made into the land owners. And third was Mahalwadi settlement, which made the village assembly as the controller of village land. But the village assemblies were, without any exception, dominated by higher caste landlords like Brahmins and Kshatriyas. So in all cases, As far as land settlements are concerned, the British colonialism strengthened and consolidated the control of higher two castes, and in a limited sense, certain Shudra castes, who are now called OBCs in the modern ethnographic terminology. The second important change introduced by the British state was rise of the ethnographic state. For the first time, we come across the definition of scheduled caste when the first census was held in 1881 by Census Commissioner H.H. Risley. And this was the first time when a juridical legal definition by a modern state was created of who a Dalit was, who an untouchable was. Whatever limited mobility within the caste system remained was finished by the Britishers, in fact. Now we come to the two positive impacts finally, and on that I will end. One was the limited capitalist development done by the British colonial state, as evident in the development of railways, postal telegraph, and certain industries and mining and metallurgy, because they, once capitalism transitioned from the stage of into the stage of imperialism, the Britishers also started investing capital, exporting capital to Indian colony. And due to that export of capital, there was a limited capitalist development in the Indian colony. And due to that, the hereditary labor division got weakened, because in urban centers and industries, it was not possible to maintain hereditary labor division and commensal prejudices like untouchability, not eating together, etc., etc. So these two registers of caste system weakened due to the limited capitalist development during the British colonial period. And fourth was the expansion of education, modern education in certain presidencies of British colony, like Madras presidency, Bombay presidency. There was some limited educational work among Dalits. Dalits were allowed to study in schools, study English, etc. But this was a very limited impact, very limited impact. In the main, if you judge the British colonial period, it actually strengthened the caste system in certain ways. And those who are interested to understand how, they can read, there is a very good book by a subaltern historian. I don't agree with everything what he says, but it's called Castes of Mind by Nicholas Dirks. It's a very good book, which shows how Britishers strengthened caste system. The only problem with that book is that he says that they constructed caste. As if before the Britishers, everything was good. The Britishers came and they ended the internal mobility of caste system, and somehow they created or constructed caste. That is going a little bit too far. But it is true that the Britishers did strengthen and consolidate the caste system. So here I'll end this presentation, and I would be glad to have questions from listeners.
Okay. Before we go there, I think Jean has some announcements to make. So Jean, please do that, and then we'll go to the question and answer period.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that very interesting talk, and I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions. I know I have some comments, but let me just remind you that next week we have another topic. It will be on COVID-19 in India. We don't have the precise title yet. Maybe Raj can tell us that.
Yeah, it's actually, it is COVID-19 and neoliberalism. It's okay. how they're related.
Excellent. So the other thing we need to remind you about is that we do rely on contributions. We are not funded by the Soros Foundation or the CIA or any other foundation. Instead, we rely on our participants. So I will put into the chat how you can contact us. And I don't know if our treasurer, Richard, wants to say anything on that.
Richard, you want to say something?
Richard, you need to unmute yourself if you're going to say anything.
While he's being silent, I did put that into, well, I'm putting it into the.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I unmuted Richard.
It's in there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
If you wanna, yeah.
What is it?
Go ahead, Richard.
No, I have nothing more to add.
Oh, okay. Then I'll meet you back.
So shall we go to the question and answer? Before we go there, I want to tell you the lecture the talk by Abhinav is in two parts. So the second part is coming 2 weeks from now, which will focus on caste and class and how it impacts the prospects of a socialist transformation of India. So with that, let's go to our question answer, and I would like to let's see. Jean wanted to make some comments, so maybe we'll start with Jean. Jean, are you prepared to do your thing? And you can have extra 2 minutes, so you can have 4 minutes. Typically, our question answer goes like each participant can raise their hands either physically if their camera is on, and I will notice that and I will make a note of it and go there, or by using the software here to raise your hand electronically. And if you need help, Mehmet can help you with how to do that. And then you'll have 2 minutes to either comment or raise your question. And there's no time limit for the speaker Abhinav to respond. So that's how we'll proceed. But let's start with Jean, who wanted to say something.
Raj, before you go, let me just very briefly explain how to raise your hand. If you go to the participants at the bottom of your screen and click on it, there is going to be a little window coming up, participants. And at the bottom of that little window, there is raise your hand or, lower your hand. So if you raise it, the hosts will see that you want to speak. If you are on the phone and you want to raise your hand, then *9 is going to raise your hand. And again, *9 is going to lower your hand. So you can get attention by that. You go back, Raj. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Jean, you had asked me that you want about 4 minutes to talk about caste development in Japan and compare it. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, well, I thank you very much, Professor Shia. This was very enlightening, and I think we all need to bring these lessons back to apply them to our own situation here, where we have a very rigid racial caste system. But not everyone knows that Japan has and had a very rigid caste system developing out of the feudal period, which persists in modified form today. And this was a topic where I did my own research because it was very interesting from an anthropological standpoint that there is untouchables in Japan, rigidly discriminated against. And what's interesting is they're also sometimes known as Japan's invisible race, because Japan is a racially homogeneous society in which there have been no migrations in and out for well over 1,000 years. Yet there is this caste system there. There are people in Japanese society are put down beneath Japanese society, are the objects of discrimination. So my research was based on saying, well, why is this? And the usual explanation by bourgeois anthropologists was that, well, they're discriminated because they perform dirty things like killing cattle and leather working and things like that, polluting things. And when I went there, I fell in with I was fortunate that I linked myself to a research institute that was affiliated with the Japan Communist Party. And these were, again, Marxists, and basically they had done all my research for me. So all I had to do was find out what they had already found out. But it was kind of summarized by one of the posters of the Outcast, the Liberation League. that showed, on the one hand, it showed a outcast killing a cow, and for this he was pressed down below society. The other side showed a samurai killing a peasant and elevated above society. So here we have, killing people and killing cattle. They're both killing, both bloody. They should be both polluting, but one is treated in an honorific manner, the other is despised and looked down upon. So that was interesting. And it turns out that, as is the case in India, I gather that this is a product of the needs of the ruling class to divide society, and they need someone to discriminate against. If they're elevated above society, they need other people to discriminate against, to blame for all the problems in society. And of course, they pick the outcasts. So that was a very interesting topic, and I thank you very much. And I just wanted to add, this is a kind of type example we all need to learn from, but it exists elsewhere too. It continues to exist in modified form in Japan. And of course, we have very rabid form here in the United States. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Raj? Oh.
Raj is mute.
Oh, yeah, I unmuted you, Raj. Or I'm trying to.
I'm going to unmute myself. Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Dia hasn't raised his hand, so he's the one to comment or question.
I have two questions. The first one has to do with the distribution of skin color in South Asia. The word Varna literally means color, and the relationship between skin color and your position in the different Varnas is something that's very intriguing, but you didn't comment on that. So I was wondering if you would like to comment on that, because I mean, it's a fact of life that the different Varnas tend to have different skin color. The second question I have is, how many castes do you think there are in India? My guess would be 1,000.
So shall I respond question by question?
Yes, you have no time limit. You please respond.
Okay. So first thing is, Varna is definitely, it refers to color, but what happened is very interesting. The pre-Vedic Aryans got mixed up with the Aboriginal population of Indian subcontinent. So obviously there were changes, genetic changes and racial changes, which manifested in the color of skin. But interestingly enough, there were certain Vedic tribes also, and there was because Aryan invasion was not one homogeneous monolithic thing, and there were Vedic tribes which were fighting amongst themselves. So Subira Jaiswal, in her book, The Making of Brahminical Hegemony, she gives ample evidence to show that certain Vedic tribes which had been defeated by other Vedic tribes, they were also demoted to the status of Shudras. So Varna, as far etymologically, yes, it refers to skin color, and yes, it has origin in the fact that those pre-Vedic Aryans who were defeated and who got mixed up with the Aboriginal population of Indian subcontinent, there was change in the color of skin, change of in the color of hair and all. And due to that, the origin of this word comes from there. But the fact is that many Vedic tribes which were defeated in their internecine warfare were also demoted to the status of Shudra. So yes, I could not address that question because I was quite, a lot of time, for a lot of time I was thinking that I don't have enough time, so a lot of things I skipped. But yes, you pointed it correctly that it referred to the skin color, but how the historical process happened, there was, now you can't talk about any relation. Caste is not racial, or caste Varna system as it emerged and evolved, it ceased to have any racial connotation. The first colonial administrator, it talked about the length of nose to differentiate between the Aryans and non-Aryans and the Shudras and the Shudras and Dalits on the one hand, and Kshatriyas and Aryans and Vaishyas and the so-called Aryans on the other hand. But later research proved beyond any doubt that there is no racial dimension of caste Varna division. Now, though the word itself originated from that. The second thing is the actual number of castes as enumerated by the ethnographic practices of Indian state is much higher than 1,000. It is somewhere around 3,600 in India, the number of castes. So there are a lot of castes within the four Varnas in India. So, and all of these castes basically represent that same process of assimilation of different tribes into the Vedic civilization as the Vedic civilization expanded into the different parts of Indian subcontinent. Does that answer your question, comrade?
Okay, so I'm looking for, your lecture was so good that people are still thinking about what to ask. So I will go next unless somebody else has a question. Yeah. Okay.
Raj, would you like me to time the questions?
Yeah. If you, okay. It looks like we don't have to do much because there's not that many questions right now.
Okay.
So
two hands.
Okay, so let John go first. John or Philomena, they have a question. I'll hold my comment and question. Then there's Norma and Eric G. So we'll go in that sequence. John.
Well, I have a comment on the Japanese case because if you've ever read 7 Years in Tibet and know about Tibetan culture, the same caste idea of being an outcast for people who do jobs like killing cows, tanning leather, that exists in Tibet. It's rather in the Tibetan and other Buddhist culture that people who do those kind of jobs are looked down on. And that's just a little thing I'm throwing in.
Okay, do you want to comment on that before I go to Norma? Abhinav?
No, I'm not very much familiar with the Japanese case. So, but this much is true that in Tibet also the Buddhist civilization, it went there from India, and the Buddhism, the Buddhist religion itself made a compromise with Varna-Caste system, though it critiqued the Brahminical ideology on the ideological plane, but the social reality of caste and Varna was not challenged by Buddhism. And two examples of that are that the indebted peasants, the women, and the soldiers were not allowed to take pravrajya. Pravrajya is when you become a Buddhist monk. So they were not allowed to join the Buddhist monasteries. If the women wanted to join the Buddhist monasteries, they were supposed to take permission from their husbands. If the soldiers wanted to join the Buddhist monasteries, they were supposed to take permission from the king. And the indebted peasants and slaves, they could not join the Buddhist monastery by taking pravajya unless and until they repaid their debt and became free. So the caste system also infiltrated the Buddhist religious system also. And therefore, it is not very surprising that in Tibet also there are people who do menial jobs, so-called menial jobs, so-called lowly jobs, and they are looked down upon by the rest of the society. The only thing which makes the Hindu caste system different is that it's very rigid due to religious codification of this relation of domination. Otherwise, if you read Marx in Capital, he talks about the ways in which the Irish workers were looked down upon by the other workers in England. So there are relations of social oppression which always develop along with relations of economic exploitation. But in very few cases, they get religiously and ritualistically codified. The nearest example which we find to the Hindu caste system is the Egyptian caste system. But even Egyptian caste system is not that rigid or that watertight kind of. So this is the only tentative observation that I wanted to make.
Okay, I'll go to the next person, who is Norma Harrison. Norma, You have 2 minutes or thereabouts.
I, this is lovely. The presentation is wonderfully scholarly. I'd like to have access to it to put as part of the Peace and Freedom Party's information to our constituents. To comment, just as we find it next to impossible to remember that Earth is round, that there is no down there, which of course is a demeaning way of talking about places like places in India or Cuba. Going down there to Cuba is ridiculous since it's so much going up. We have an immense hurdle, and so far, which is so far impossible to mount, as you've all been talking about, to create that the care activities are of the upper level of status. They need to be moved there. It needs to be the most respectable thing to do housework. The most respectable thing to do any kind of nursing or care of people, any kind of care of individuals or groups of people. It has to be raised to the highest level of behavior. The idea that the imaginers of how to do the established society well have to be lowered more and more so that we can begin to see that that's what they're about. Even teachers take the position of anointing the established system as being the right system and of pushing it into being venerated, and the teacher as the authority for doing that is made into some elevated status, which it doesn't deserve any more than priests, the preachers, the religions that further back the continuation of our oppressive regimes need to be pulled out from under those people and made, and us who tend the farms, for example, farming, everybody
2.5
wants
minutes.
Everybody, it's so difficult. There's so little time. There's only an hour, well, half an hour. Anyway, everybody wants to put their hands in the ground and grow things, and people think that it's just a very bad thing to do. That's because there's not enough people doing it, and so it becomes very hard work. If you did it for a couple hours a week instead of for an 8-hour day bending over and all, it would be an entirely different, it would be the joy of putting your hands in the earth and creating what we need, what we like, flowers and corn, so forth. We need to begin to perceive the status of our production as joyful if we're allowed to do it meaningfully and relevantly to our existence, to our aesthetic.
3.5 minutes, okay.
Okay, that's fine. Abhinav, please respond if you want to, otherwise I'll go. You have the
yeah,
thing.
just a small comment that I totally agree that such a system would be beneficial to everybody, and it will do away with all the discrimination based on economic, social, or cultural status. The only thing is that the capitalist system, within the ambit of capitalist system, it is not possible because
Exactly.
Yeah, so the motto of capitalist system, as Marx said, is using money to make more money, ad infinitum, and that puts the bulk of world's population to the most horrible conditions of work, long working hours, and everything. And we have everything. If you talk about the reserved food grains of world, for example, in India, we have enough food during the lockdown. If no industrial activity or agricultural activity is done, we can eat for 7 months without producing anything at all. All food, cloth, houses, everything we have. But it's the capitalist production relation that prevents any kind of remedy, because its motto is exploitation of labor to create more and more profit ad infinitum. And this is also the reason for the crisis of capitalism. As Marx said, capital itself is the barrier to capital. There is no other barrier to capital. So this overproduction, this profit for the sake of profit, production for the sake of profit, this creates these conditions. So these manifestations of long working hours, horrible working conditions, some people working 12 hours, 14 hours in maquiladoras and all the factories of the so-called third world, and some people not working at all. They are just like, parasitic people living life of opulence and affluence without doing anything. So this cannot be done away with any kind of ideological criticism, because it's a material thing. And if it's a material thing, it needs, to use the words of Marx, the criticism by weapon. So no
By
amount
weapons? Are you saying by weapons? Yes, the guns.
No, weapon, it's a metaphor. I mean, it talks about the role of force in history, even if no weapons are used. For example, very less bloodshed happened during the storming of Winter Palace, but there was role of force. And it is the role of force which changes history. So it's a poetic expression, a literary expression, criticism by weapon, which only alludes to the fact that history doesn't change by ideological criticism. The main criticism that Marx directed against young Hegelians, that all the suffering and exploitation and oppression in the world is a material thing. And precisely for this matter, the religion also cannot be done away with by ideological criticism, unless and until the material roots, material causes, and material milieu of rise of religion and existence of religion are done away with. And same thing applies here also, that we have to think about a higher social order and work towards it.
Okay, so unless Norma, you want to engage on that point, otherwise I'll go to Eric.
I
Okay.
think everybody here knows all of that. It's wonderful.
Okay, yeah. Eric G, I'll unmute you. You are the next one on the list.
I thank you very much for the talk. It's very, very interesting. A wonderful coincidence in my life. I've only just in the last month or so begun to try to learn more about India. I've become very interested in it. I've got about 20 questions. I'll try to kind of jam them into one organizing theme. So I'm curious about caste in the context of the modern world and class conflict in India. We're aware that there's this new bourgeois class in India, like particularly related to the tech industry, but also things like Tata, industrial production and other things. The left itself, I know that there's been a communist party in India for some time. It's even controlled some state governments. And also the role of the new, or I guess it's not new, I know a little bit about the RSS, the reactionary movement, the BJP and the RSS, and their attitude toward caste and how they would speak of it, because obviously they're a mass movement as well. And just kind of as a little bit of an interesting sort of a metaphorical point to drop into the conversation, I also try to study religion. I think religion's enormously important in human history. And I think that's something Marxists have made a mistake over the years to not seek to pacify it or make it an ally, rather have simply attacked it. And I think that's a big historic strategic mistake we've made for a long time. Probably the Indian participants in this meeting will know who Sadhguru is. Sadhguru is, maybe you could think of him sort of as like a Hindu Billy Graham. He's very popular with young people. And he actually made a statement, not exactly critical of the caste system, but calling for a national social security scheme in India, and argued that then the caste system would simply go away. But of course, he argues for, not surprisingly, a social passivity and not to oppose the caste system per se. And he's enormously popular with young people. I imagine those of you of Indian origin might be a little bit aware of him. He's somewhat influential. Yeah, so what is caste in the modern world? That's all. That could be its own lead off. Anyway, thank you very, very much. I found it so interesting. I'll mute myself.
Thank you, comrade. It's a very good question, because after British colonial period, I wanted to come to the post-independence India. What happened in the post-independence India and what is happening today is that two registers of caste have become very less pronounced. Kind of they are towards being eliminated. One is the element of caste endogamy. Hereditary labor division. Hereditary labor division is not possible anymore because India is a capitalist social formation now, and more than 50% of GDP of India comes from manufacturing and services sector, which involve the kind of production mode of production which cannot sustain any kind of hereditary labor division. And you can find a composite Indian working class as far as caste profile is concerned. You will find even Brahmin workers and Kshatriya workers and higher caste workers among the Indian workers. And a lot of Indian workers comes from OBC castes, other backward classes castes, OBC castes, which are broadly Shudra castes, and more than 50% come from OBC caste, and more than 40% come from Dalit caste. So it's a very composite working class. And if they are working in the same industries, as you can imagine, they cannot practice commensal prejudices and untouchability. It is impossible. So capitalism has weakened this register of untouchability and commensal prejudices to a large extent. I won't say that it is finished, because you can still witness untouchability in rural India to a certain extent. But in urban industrial centers, untouchability it is impossible to practice untouchability. Second register which has got weakened in the independence India due to capitalist development is the hereditary labor division. For example, according to the Vedic Hindu texts, if I am son of a chamar, I can only do leather work. If I am son of a Yadav, I can only do animal husbandry, etc., etc. But that has been broken, and even Ambedkar realized that. He said that, and that is why he talked about urbanization and industrialization and put a lot of stress that we should follow a policy of industrialization and urbanization, because it will eliminate the caste system, it will weaken the caste system. So these two registers have weakened, but one register still remains, and that is the register of caste endogamy. Now, why this happened? Because capitalist mode of production has a contradiction with untouchability, and it has a contradiction with hereditary labor division, but it doesn't have a contradiction with caste endogamy. Because capitalism makes private property sacred, but caste endogamy makes private property even more sacred than sacred. So that is why caste endogamy is one dimension of caste system which still remains, because the continuity of private property, not within the same class only, it within the same family, within the same caste, is ensured through caste endogamy. So caste endogamy is something which the capitalist mode of production, as it has developed in India, it doesn't have any contradiction with that. So caste system has changed in the modern Indian scenario in this particular respect, that two registers of caste, two main pillars of caste, they have weakened. One is untouchability, and the second is hereditary labor division, because it is incongruent with capitalist mode of production. The third pillar of caste system, which is caste endogamy, marrying only within one's own caste, it has no contradiction with capitalism whatsoever. Capitalist mode of production can go on with caste endogamy ad infinitum. There is no problem in that. But caste endogamy is also slowly being breached, especially in the educated working class, I would say, even more than middle class. Caste endogamy has been breached in the educated working class. Middle class, surprisingly, is the most conservative, most right-wing, most reactionary section of Indian population right now, especially the upper middle classes, the entrepreneurial upper middle classes, rather than the salaried upper middle classes. So in the upper middle class, the caste endogamy is the strongest. And if you go down the ladder to the educated working class, caste endogamy is the weakest in certain sense. But still caste endogamy continues. So this is the situation of caste in modern India. How the bourgeoisie uses it, it uses it for two purposes. One is the bourgeoisie uses it for the distribution of resources amongst themselves, because Indian bourgeoisie itself is organized along caste lines. So you have political parties of bourgeoisie which represent certain factions of bourgeoisie, and these factions have predominantly a specific caste character. So if you talk about BJP, it began as a Brahman Baniya party. The trading class is Baniya castes, and the landlordist reactionary class is the Brahmin class. And originally, initially, the RSS BJP fascist political tendency represented the Brahmin Baniya class. And even today, it represents primarily the big capitalist class, and in terms of Varna-Caste, you can say it still represents Brahmin Baniya class in the main. But it has also won over certain peasant castes and certain backward castes. So if you look at Samajwadi Party, it represents the kulaks, what you can say, the Indian equivalent of Junkers, the German Junkers, the landlord class in India. So you have regional parties which represent this Junker class, and this Junker class is predominantly certain upward mobile other backward castes, OBCs. So you can see the caste character as well as the caste character of all these political parties of the bourgeoisie. So they use the bourgeoisie uses the caste differentiation or the caste divisions to allocate resources among themselves. It's a contradictory process. There is a lot of friction in that, but in the process of collectivizing their class interest, the bourgeois interest allocates the resources along caste lines to a certain extent. And the second use that the bourgeoisie makes of caste system is dividing the working classes, because the working classes all are also not homogeneous and monolithic, and it is constituted by various castes. So bourgeoisie first uses the caste divisions to allocate resources, to come to an agreement as to how to allocate resources among themselves. And secondly, they use through vote bank politics, they use these caste divisions to divide the masses, the working masses, of which proletariat is only one part. And then the attitude of RSS and BJP towards caste system is that they present a justification of the caste system in a you can say reformist manner. They say that Dalits are part of Hindu society, Dalits should be assimilated into Hindu society, and they have something which is called Dalit, it is called Seva Bharti. So Seva Bharti is used to do certain reform works among Dalit workers and Dalit working masses. So they have Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram, which is used to do certain reform works among the tribals. So they have this idea of hierarchy, that the Dalits and tribals should realize their place and accept their place in the Hindu society. But yes, they should be assimilated into the Hindu society. You can find certain RSS and BJP people who also criticize untouchability, but they criticize untouchability without criticizing the caste system as a whole, without criticizing the caste divisions as a whole. They only criticize one aspect, one of the most barbaric and naked manifestations of caste system, which is untouchability. So their attitude towards caste system is co-opted in the present capitalist system in a certain way, to articulate it in a certain way. So they present a reform, they often put forward a reformist argument, as presented by certain Hindu reformers in the late 19th century and early 20th century, who tried to reform the Hindu caste system. But thus, they are definitely supporters of caste system in some way, and they are supporters of Brahminical ideology directly and openly, the BJP RSS combined. And as far as religion is concerned, I think, yes, I would just rephrase what you said. I wouldn't say that it was a mistake of Marxism per se, or Marxism as such, because the principal criticism of Marx against Bauer and all the young Hegelians was that you can't do away with religion, because religion is not only the opium of the masses, it is the it is the
sigh of the
sigh of the oppressed people. It is the sigh, the tragic alas and sigh of the oppressed and exploited people. So Marx said that you cannot do away with religion unless and until the material historical conditions of religion are done away with. And Lenin categorically argued against atheistic propaganda. He said that it is not our duty to do atheistic propaganda, because it is like imagining that you can do away with religion by ideological criticism, whereas religion has material roots in society. It is a material outgrowth of the exploitative and oppressive relationships which are there in class society. So that is why I would say that this mistake has been committed by certain communists and Marxists, not Marxism or Marx as such. But yes, we need to think about that how to approach this question of religion. And Sadhguru, for example, he is a very peculiar kind of figure. He is the role model of IT professional middle class in India, the urban, educated, upward mobile yuppie class, young, upward, professional middle class of India, because he uses a lot of modern rhetorics and jargons and combines it with the religious traditionalism and conventionalism and conservatism that he preaches. But that religious conservatism is couched in liberal modern terminology, and that is why it attracts a lot of young, upward mobile, professional, middle class people. So, but his position on RSS and the fascist rise and Modi because Modi also signifies a Brahmanical reaction in Indian society. He is very much a supporter of Modi's rise. He is very much a legitimator and justifier of Modi's regime in India right now. So he never criticized caste system as such, and anything like proposing a national social security scheme kind of thing. He says that because he has to also maintain his following, but actually he is against any kind of nationalization policies. He, in one instance, he actually opposed nationalization of education system and equal and uniform school system. He was totally in support of private schools and private entrepreneurship. So there are a lot of contradictions in what he says, and that contradictions are actually manifestations of the tightrope walking that he's doing. On the one hand, he is a representative of Indian casteist, Brahmanical, capitalist conservatism, and landlordist, not non-landlordist type, but obviously a representative of Indian conservatism. And on the other hand, he wants to attract the young urban middle class. So this tightrope walking leads him to certain contradictory statements. So he might have said something about national security, social security scheme, and might have said that it would do away with caste system, but it's not his original color. His original color is very much pro-fascist, pro-Brahmanical.
Okay, Norma has hands up, but before I go to Norma, is there anybody else who has not spoken who wants to comment or raise a question? Okay, Norma, I will lower your hand, please. Go ahead.
Just religion has to be allowed to die, to fade away, because following the event, to quote Fidel, everybody eats the same. And upon that justice, the material justice, people no longer need to pray to have dinner or a nice life.
Okay, so I have, since
I see you smiling, Abhinav. I see you smiling.
Yeah, I totally agree. In fact, I was going to come to the same point, that the origin of religion, according to Marx, on the one hand, in the primitive society was ignorance, the period of magical worldview and the emergence of religions. And in the modern society is the uncertain social and economic insecurity and uncertainty, which the bourgeois society, capitalist society produces and reproduces on a daily basis. So
it's a different thing. It's a different thing to offer up enjoyment. Oh, it's a wonderful world, and we're so grateful to be living in a beautiful place like this, and to have all these people and flowers, and that's different from saying, "Oh, please God, get," you know. I mean, it's man that creates God or humans.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I will ask you a question,
Yeah.
Abhinav. Now, you know, this is kind of probably related to your second talk, but I will go ahead and ask now. We can develop it further in the next talk, which is that during this coronavirus crisis, which Modi announced with 4 hours notice to shut down the country, literally lock down the country, which made about, I don't know, I think the migrant labor is something over 100 million, 120 to 140 million. And some of them come from the same state, the migrant from village to city, and the others are across the borders into urban areas. All of a sudden, they were left with no basis, a way of supporting themselves, not even the cheap food outlets, they were all closed. And there was a crisis, and somebody has suggested that this may be this insensitivity towards them is not simply a class insensitivity, but actually because most of them are lower caste people who would be Shudras or Dalits. Do you want to explain a little bit on what your point of view is on that?
Yes,
how is this related to caste, if at all?
Yes, comrade. You have pointed out a very important thing. In fact, the total number of proletariat who have no property, no land whatsoever, is around 540 million in India. And there are then 270 million poor marginal peasants who, to use Lenin's term, are semi-proletariat, because their principal mode of livelihood, means of livelihood, is not agriculture but wage labor. So if you talk about these 810 million population of proletariat and semi-proletariat, they predominantly come from Shudra castes, OBC castes, and Dalits, and around 10 to 15% of them now come from upper castes. So since the bulk of them come from Shudra and Dalit castes, whenever the class exploitation of these workers takes place, there is also elements of social oppression based on caste discriminations are involved there. So I would say not only in this crisis which was produced by Corona pandemic and Modi government's total mismanagement and unplanned lockdown and all, even before that, on a day-to-day basis, the economic exploitation of all these workers was always intertwined with caste-based oppression. And this I say in two theses which capture the reality. One, the first thesis is that every worker is exploited, but the Dalit worker is super exploited on account of his vulnerable social position at the lower end of the caste ladder. Every Dalit is oppressed. The second thesis is every Dalit is oppressed, but the working class Dalits face the most barbaric forms of social oppression because they are also economically vulnerable. So these two theses, one, every worker is exploited, but the Dalit worker is super exploited or exploited due to his vulnerable social position in the caste hierarchy. And every Dalit is oppressed, but the working class Dalit faces the most naked and barbaric forms of oppression, as you can see from the last 30 years of anti-Dalit atrocities. In 99% of the cases, the victims belong to the working class, not the middle class, not the upper class Dalits, but the working class Dalits. So every Dalit is oppressed, yes, but the working class Dalits face the most barbaric and naked form of oppression. And in this Corona crisis also, for example, about the domestic workers, every time this callousness of the government and this insensitive attitude of not only of the government, but also the bourgeoisie and upper middle classes, the upper echelons of petty bourgeoisie, there is an element of caste discrimination always involved in the processes of economic exploitation of the working class of India. That's true. And it happened this time also.
Thank you. So next person, lower the hand, Sharon Rose. Please go ahead.
Thank you.
I'm going to step out for a minute, so please proceed. Jean is there.
I just wanted to say that, in my opinion, it's a mistake to refer to the racist system that we have, racial division system that we have in the United States, as a caste system. The racial divisions in the United States were created by capitalism, by capitalist
Yes.
development on this continent, which was started as a settler colonial society 500 years ago. And it does not compare with what the comrade has been describing for that of 2,000 years history or 4,000 years history. So I think we should recognize the similarities, but I think we should stick with the category of, racism and racial divisions, which serve only the interests of the ruling class to divide and stratify the working class in the United States and prevent the growth of class consciousness. And so I think I look forward to your next presentation, comrade, because I think you'll talk about how the caste system prevents the class solidarity and unity in India.
Sure. In fact, I totally agree with Comrade Sharon, because racism is a capitalist construct. In the pre-capitalist period, in fact, the embryonic forms of racism came into existence after the colonial voyages of 16th and 17th century. We find racial differences, but racism is not simply racial differences, and it cannot be reduced to racial differences. And we find in the medieval Europe, if you even read Don Quixote of Cervantes, you find that there were racial differences. Actually, he talks about those racial differences in a Spanish country. But these racial differences do not constitute racism as such, because identities do not become sites of social oppression by themselves. Had it been true, we would be obliged to say that men oppress women because they're men. But we know that men do not oppress women because they're men. There are certain relations historically constituted, production relations and economic relations, which make certain identities sites of social oppression. And that is why I don't agree with the theories of white privilege or the theories of intersectionality, because it replaces identity. It replaces the class argument with the argument of identity. Because someone, for example, is progressive just because someone is women or Dalit or black or whatever. That is not true. We have a lot of reactionary Dalit theorists in India who totally wholeheartedly support the Modi's fascist cries, and you cannot replace political line with identity. Political line is something which is constituted through struggles. It has a relative autonomy from one's location as far as the identity is concerned. So yes, I would say that different forms of exploitative social systems, they give rise of a variety of systems of social oppression. Casteism is one, racism is one, patriarchy is another, but we must distinguish between them, because it is not an academic exercise. We want to devise concrete strategies to fight against these forms of social oppression, and we need to distinguish between them scientifically and historically. So I totally agree with Comrade Sharon.
Jean, I think you have to unmute yourself, but you had your hand raised. Jean?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here now, I think. Yeah, I want to respond to a couple comments. First of all, in terms of the race caste situation, my reference there is Oliver Cox, who's a black sociologist, wrote Class, Caste, and Race in, I think, 1948. So that's had an influence, and that stimulated me. And I think it's definitely worthy of discussion for the debate, and we ought to throw that in there one of these times, maybe get some of our African-American colleagues to weigh in on the topic also. The other thing I just wanted to say is we touch upon religion, and people seem to like the idea that it comes out of class oppression. But I just want to remark that religion predates class society. If you go to our systems, hunters and gatherers, and what I call ancestral communism, you see a very rich religious life that includes religion as a source of social solidarity, of expressing the joy of death and also the joy of life as well as the pain of death. So I just wanted to say that religion does have multiple roots in the human condition, and that one can't dismiss it very easily, although one does have to realize the way it is utilized within the class struggle. So I just wanted to make those comments, and I realize that both of these things are worthy of a whole another 2 hours, but not today.
You want to respond, Abhinav? To that?
Just a couple of comments. Marx and Engels have differentiated between the magical worldview and religious worldview. So one was the period of a pre-class tribal society, when we find a magical worldview where people, and it actually expressed their collectivity of the pre-class tribal society. And it actually expressed, there was certain totemism, but religion is not simply totemism. There was an element of totemism where natural forces were imagined, were personified and imagined as a certain person or who have superpowers. And this magical worldview later emerged into, or converted into, changed into religious worldview. So yes, as Marx and Engels both accept that one source is ignorance. When people didn't know, when masses didn't know what are the reasons or causality of various natural phenomena, they, and it was also a practice of collective grief. Also, when someone died, for example, in fact, George Thomson has talked about this in great detail in his book Human Essence, where he talks about the period of magical worldview, the tribal totemism, and how it expressed the production relations of that time, and how it emerged into religious worldview, and how we need to distinguish between the period of religious worldview and magical worldview. So yes, one source is ignorance, as Marx and Engels themselves say, and another source is the oppression, exploitation, grief, sorrow, the tragedy of class society. So we cannot wish it away. I totally agree with Comrade Jean, but yes, we need to understand it historically.
Okay, the next person is Dave. Dave, you have to unmute yourself.
Hi, Abhinav. I just wanted to thank you. This was the best exposition I have heard on the caste system and,
thank you, Comrade.
and the overall, getting the overall picture. I am Sikh, and I always talk with Raj and say that Sikh Guru Gobind Singh, he tried to eliminate the caste system completely. And if you are real Sikh, they should not be following the caste system, but it still exists in Punjab, and it just shows that the class system, so long as the classes are there, the caste system is embedded into the Indian mind,
Exactly.
So thank you again.
Nailed it.
Okay, so your time is up, but I wanted to ask one more question.
Yeah.
If you can extend it by a couple more minutes. How do you see, no doubt you have observed what is going on in the United States with this demonstration against the barbaric killing of a black man by police. And in India, the same barbarism is visited upon Dalits numerous times, and what do you see the similarities between them? You have any comment on that? And then we will go, we will end this session unless somebody else has a quick question.
Whatever I know about the present, I would call it uprising, which is going on in the US, is only through some certain websites and newspapers. So I might be wrong about certain facts. But I wanted to point out two things. One is Indian society is a society where capitalism developed without any democratic revolution. So what Marx said about Bismarckian Germany applies to Indian context to, in a certain sense. Marx said that we are not uh, uh, affected so much by the development of capitalism in Germany, but by the lack of development of capitalism in Germany, uh, which was a metaphorical, allegorical statement which was only meant to convey that since capitalism developed in Germany in a non-revolutionary fashion without any democratic revolutions, different kinds of pre-capitalist primordial consciousness exists among the masses. The lack of democratic consciousness exists there in the Indian society, and that is why, as we say in Hindi, sabr ka pyala chalakna. The Comrade Raj would help me there. Sabr ka pyala chalakna means when your patience runs out.
Yeah.
You know, it happens. It happens after a lot of time in India. We Indians are, due to this lack of democratic revolution historically and democratic traditions, though there were before coming British, there was a Bhakti movement and Sufi movement which expressed the same aspirations which were expressed by Luther in and Calvin in Europe. But that natural development was suppressed due to colonization, and that was a big loss for India historically. But then again, I think what is happening in the US now is not only due to the killing of a black man, Floyd. It is also a tipping point. It was also a kind of a tipping point, which, you know, unleashed the anger of common working masses against the kind of police state that exists there, the police brutalities that happen there on a daily basis. And also due to the economic collapse, economic crisis was already there. All of us know that. Corona was only a trigger effect which kind of deepened this crisis. But kind of the job losses, the PMI, Producers Manager Index, has dipped to a level which is not even comparable to the Great Depression, which shows the PMI is the index which shows buying and selling among capitalists, which actually shows the health of a capitalist economy, not underconsumption, but the rate of profit. And rate of profit goes down, rate of investment goes down, and selling and buying among capitalists goes down. And that is measured by PMI. And PMI is at a historical low in the US economy. And Michael Roberts, the British Marxist political economist, he has said that this downturn is not going to go away till 2030. So we'll be in an economic stagnation for a long period. And this has already resulted in unprecedented job losses and this whole economic and social insecurity on the one hand, and on the other hand, the increasing oppressiveness, the right-wing, rabid right-wing government of Trump and its increasing oppressiveness. All that was getting accumulated. And these quantitative developments ultimately resulted into a qualitative leap after the killing of Floyd. And I consider it not only as one separate incident, just like it's like a tipping point which unleashed the accumulated anger and dissatisfaction of American masses. But I won't pin my hopes on this for a revolutionary transformation, because unless and until there is a revolutionary leadership and political line, the riots can be there. And riots, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, is the voice of the unheard. So all the unheard people will express themselves in this anarchic, chaotic situation of riot, the oppressed, exploited people. But unless and until this explosion of energy is channelized into a definite orientation and direction by a political leadership, a revolutionary party, I wouldn't pin my hopes too high on this uprising.
Okay, so I have one more hand up, but the time is really up. So Norma, can you do it in 30 seconds, please?
Absolutely. Just to talk about Tibet, people have all seen Michael Parenti on the myths of, what is that? The myths about Tibet. I wrote it down here and I don't have it anyway. Parenti and here it is. Friendly Feudalism, the Tibet Myth by Parenti. And the other one I have here is the When Serfs Stood Up in Tibet. Anna Louise Strong visited Tibet in '59 and wrote about it. And I have another couple, this Republican librarian from Hayward gave me this book, and I cannot remember their names. It's also another lovely report about a couple who went, a kind of United States couple, went to Tibet to see what was going on and gave a similar report to what is being said in these three books. The Red Army camped outside Lhasa for 2 years and gave the strength to the Tibetan people to think that they could rise against their enormous persecution in Tibet, which they did. And they just kind of walked in and took over. There was very little fighting of any kind or damage and so forth. The whole reports are so extended as to be very frightening, but they're wrong and they're biased.
Okay. Thank you, Norma. So I want to thank Abhinav. He's stayed past midnight to do this. It's 1 o'clock, past 1 o'clock, his midnight.
Oh my God.
So thank you, Abhinav, and we'll be
Thank you.
really appreciate a vote of thanks from all of us to you for this presentation, and we look forward to your second part of the talk, which will be more contemporary period and class struggle in India 2 weeks from now. So thank you once again. Good night to you. And everybody here, have a good week ahead. And we'll see you next Sunday when we have another speaker from India, Basudev Nath Chaudhary, speaking on COVID-19 and neoliberalism.
Yeah.
So will this, Mehmet, I think you can proceed to close this, and thanks
Thank you, everyone. It was an excellent presentation and discussion.